In this lecture, we're looking at Voltaire and the radical Enlightenment. And what we're doing in this lecture is we've looked already at the scientific revolution and some of the changes there, the paradigm shifts in terms of the science that's involved. This was the great lurch forward. This was the time when everything seemed to be changing, when there were advancements on the rise in every field, both in terms of technology and in terms of our awareness of the ways that the physical world works. What we're going to look at in this lecture, though, is the philosophical side of the radical Enlightenment. And we've chosen to focus on Voltaire, not because he's the only figure, not by any means, but because Voltaire really is one of the more celebrated figures of the more radical Enlightenment of the 18th century. And because Voltaire is a very interesting character. He's a Frenchman who was exiled for a time in England. He later lives for a time in Geneva, and the focus of so much of his work is on the new cosmopolitan understanding of the way that all these different cultures throughout Europe, as well as around the world, were forcing intellectuals to reconsider the foundations of their thinking. So you might say that Voltaire is a microcosm of so much of the radical philosophical Enlightenment. And we can begin with the context. What is going on in the 18th century that is causing so much change? Part of it is socioeconomics, and part of it is in the intellectual world. In terms of socioeconomics, with the rapid expansion of the British and the French, as well as other countries around the world, what begins to come on the rise is the fact that all these European countries and the leaders of these groups, the intellectuals and the writers, suddenly become far more aware of the sheer diversity around the world as to the fundamental questions of faith, life, and morality. So in the British Empire or the French Empire or the Dutch set up significant colonies and trade in the Far East, or when the Spanish and the Portuguese or in Central and South America, or when a lot of these different countries come to North America, they come in contact with a number of different natives from all of these different countries around the world, and they begin to trickle back all these recounts, all these stories as to the differences in culture, practice, and faith that by and large Europeans were unaware of before. You might say that this is one of the first impressions, one of the more pregnant moments where you see this new perspective come into the minds of people in Europe, that their perspective on things is not the only one. Their faith, their practice, all these things, they begin to realize, might be historically or culturally conditioned. And that is to say nothing of the variety now within the West and within the Americas of the different Christian perspectives on things. And we're not just talking about Catholic versus Protestant. We're talking about the wide variety of a number of different Protestant perspectives on things like faith and practice. It might be put this way: the things that were different between the various Protestant groups, or in general between Protestants and Catholics, were the things that you can see on the outward side first and foremost. If you and I were to go to a Quaker service, and then the following Sunday go to a Presbyterian service, and then the next Sunday attend a Catholic Mass, and then after that attend a Baptist congregational meeting, we would be struck by all the differences of perspective and practice, not only in our own day, but obviously in the context of the 18th century. You add to that mix, though, the variety of different countries and practices around the world, people that are not Christian but have either indigenous faith or one of the great faiths of the ancient world, whether it's Asian or South American or whatnot. So what happens in the 18th century in terms of the philosophical awareness of the world around them is Europeans suddenly become a bit enamored, somewhat paternalistically of course, but they become enamored with the variety of expressions around the world. If you were to go to London and go to the National Portrait Gallery, which is a wonderful museum, it takes all the best portraits of all the major figures, predominantly of English culture, but often of others as well, and they're all there in one museum. People usually get a chuckle when they go into the 18th century wing of that building and they begin to look at these portraits. They start to notice a lot of funny things in the portraits. Things like turbans, strange fashion choices that suddenly seem to come out of nowhere. Well, you might say that's an example of what we're talking about. This type of engagement, in this case with Arabian culture, is a new thing, in particular in England. One of the more important books, one of the more successful publications in the 18th century was the book 1001 Arabian Nights. Now, from the vantage of the 21st century, we can realize that a lot of this engagement with Arabic culture, or with the wider area of the Middle East, or India, or these kinds of things, certainly is not as complex as it was in those actual countries. But the 18th century can be forgiven for not having the sheer amount of information at our fingertips that we have today if we wanted to, say, explore the culture of another country. In their own day, this is revolutionary. They are aware of all this variety around the world. So that's the, again, cultural or socioeconomic changes that are afoot. There's another thing that syncs up with this, though, in the philosophical arena. You'll recall in our first lecture on the Enlightenment that we were talking about the philosophy of Descartes. Descartes is either hailed or maligned, depending on the perspective of modern philosophers or theologians, because of his radical commitment to the idea that assurance or certainty needs to be based on the rational method of whatever my mind can deduce or infer from the world around us. Descartes is more of the classical, abstract philosopher. He goes deep into the mind, not so much into the terms of experience, but deep into the mind as he weighs out the question as to what we can know and what we can be certain of. So the Cartesian revolution, we said then, was this move to believe that it's our rationality or our perspective that is the only guarantee of certainty. You move forward, though, and you get to the teachings of John Locke, who we've mentioned once or twice before. And the importance of Locke is that he comes up with an alternative understanding of what philosophers call epistemology, which is specifically, again, this question, how can I know what I know? What process does my mind go through when it learns things? And Locke had a very radical and a very important change to add to the question of epistemology. Locke essentially differs with Descartes, not in terms of his goal, not in terms of what he wants when he's discussing epistemology, but in the method that he describes as how we learn what we learn. Locke is a radical, experienced person, you might say. For Locke, the way the mind works is that it is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, we said. And I described that in the modern world as something like a computer without software. When we are born into this world, we don't come with precognition or a set of assumptions or presuppositions that allows us to make sense of the world. You might say that in this sense, Locke is the anti-Platonist. There's no world of the forms, there's no abstract concepts out there somewhere, whether in the mind of God or simply on their own, that we tap into whenever we engage with the world. No, Locke says that the way we come to knowledge of anything is through our experiences. So the moral code is learned, our understanding of the faith, our understanding of culture. All of these things are purely conditioned by our experiences. And that Lockean philosophy is vital, though it's not embraced by everybody. But for those who do embrace it, Locke's understanding of the way that we come to knowledge is not simply a theory about how our minds work. It's also a theory as to how the world works. If the world around us is more relative, if all that we are getting from it is experiences from which we might extrapolate general principles, well, that would seem to make the case that morality itself, our cultures, our languages, everything about us, is itself a relative situation or a relative proposition. And again, I think people in the 21st century far more intuitively understand this. We know that if we grew up in a different country, let's say you're American, or you're British, or you're Russian. Well, if we take these three people and we move them around, and the Russian person is raised in the American context, and so on and so forth, we all assume that there's going to be different instincts, different relative cultural values that each person is going to come away with as a result of their different contexts. Locke, you might say, absolutizes this process, and he makes it just simply axiomatic. The way we come to knowledge, the way we come to the expression of who we are, is entirely bound by our experiences. Now, what does all this have to do with the Enlightenment? Well, it is an ancient question. It's a almost universal question. Whenever someone is asking the question about the fundamentals of life, as to what is absolute and what is relative. Now, it's a myth that all people prior to the Enlightenment just saw everything as absolute. They certainly were more inclined towards more diverse ideas being absolute and fewer things being relative. But it's always been a question. We see change in the world around us, we see relativity, we see one culture, one language, what is absolute and what is relative. That's a more philosophical question, obviously, but it really gets at the question of life. Is my morality, is my faith relative? Is it just something I hold, or is there some eternal, absolute truth that I am embracing? And at the risk of being overly simplistic, you might say that the pre-Enlightenment world kept all the things of the faith and doctrine and ethics and of the rightness and wrongness of the things around them in the category of the absolutes. This is obviously the case with the faith. No one in the Middle Ages believed that faith was relative. There was one faith handed down, and though we might debate the limits of my ability to describe the faith, it was often assumed that differences of expression of the faith was a problem of right and wrong, maybe of gray area to be sure, but that gray area was not seen as a qualifier to the fact that their faith was absolute. Rather, it was an opportunity for maybe the scholastics, maybe the humanists, to get involved with trying to clarify what we believe about something versus what we shouldn't believe about it. After the Enlightenment, after the Cartesian Revolution and the time of Locke and all these cultural changes, in particular in the 18th century, the main thing that begins to happen in terms of the thought life of Europe and by extension in America is that things like faith and ethics and culture get moved more radically into the relative category. They are taken out of the context of being one of the absolutes, and they are moved over to the side of relativism. Now notice I didn't say that only Enlightenment people are relativists. Everyone, again, throughout the history of, frankly, human thought, has always debated what is timeless and what is temporal or momentary. I mean, we can do this in all kinds of arenas, but the main thing with the radical Enlightenment is they're moving the faith, doctrine, practice, and in some senses ethics, over to the category of being relative. Now, there is some ambiguity here in the Enlightenment understanding of virtue and morality and ethics. Some argued, a little more radically, that ethics itself, our moral code, is itself relative. Just to take one example, when Europeans come in contact with other cultures, one of the things they begin to notice is that not everyone shares their view of marriage. Marriage being one man and one woman. In certain countries in the Middle East and in other places around the world, they hear stories of harems or of polygamy. They also hear of stories of people marrying people that are more closely associated with their immediate family, cousins marrying and these kinds of things. Things that were considered to be, in a previous era, maybe in the Middle Ages, so obviously part of the absolute structure of the world that when they would come in contact with this, it just simply throws them for a loop. And again, there was some ambiguity as to the role of ethics. Some argue that by and large, the majority of our ethical assumptions, of our ethical codes, are culture-bound and therefore relative. They then, however, will appeal to something called natural law, and they attempt to use reason and logic and all these methods to come up with a set of basic human assumptions that everyone must abide by. They'll notice, for example, that no culture condones murder outright, and so they'll try to find things that are timeless in the code of ethics. Others will be a little bit more conservative on the question, and they will try to keep the majority of their, you might say, Christian European ethics, but they'll try to take the faith component out of them, and they'll try to argue that all these pieces are based on logic or reason and on the principles of the Enlightenment. And there's a great deal of complexity here. We don't want to make it overly simple. But by and large, what is happening in the radical Enlightenment, again, is that faith is being moved over to the relative side of this equation. For everyone, though, involved in the Enlightenment, in particular in the 18th century, for all the leading thinkers, the great hope was that science and reason would be the things that guarantee an adequate foundation and structure for the world around them. They were optimistic, in other words, that in their categories, though they had moved faith over, that their principles of reason, of process, and of logical thinking, of the sciences, would be the thing that guarantees our foundations. Okay, so if that's the context, how does Voltaire fit into this, and how does he embody this change? Well, in part, he embodies it in his own personal life. Voltaire was born in 1694, and he lived until 1778, which is of course right in the context of the American Revolution. He was not born with the name Voltaire. His birth name was actually François-Marie Arouet. More on that in a minute. He was born in the city of Paris. His family had some means, and so he was given a very good education. He first of all studied with the Jesuits, where he learned Greek and Latin, and then his father wanted him to be a lawyer. Voltaire wanted nothing to do with this, and so he tricked his father at one point, and he was living under the pretenses of being a notary, but in the meantime he was actually a poet. His father finds out and then does eventually twist his arm to go to law school. While he is still a relatively young man, he gets involved with a love affair with a woman who is a Protestant refugee to the area of France. This in some ways forms the context throughout Voltaire's life of his philosophical commitment to tolerance and religious expression. Here he is a Catholic man, very much part of the French culture. And we have to remind ourselves here, France has an absolute monarchy. The king is supreme, still during Voltaire's life. It's also overtly Catholic, going all the way back to the days of the Huguenots. And in France, of course, just like in the 16th and 17th centuries, the wedding of Catholic religion with this French absolutist understanding of the king meant that there was a great deal of oppression of both free speech and process whenever the nobility wanted to push something. But here Voltaire falls in love, has a love affair with a French refugee. And that eventually comes to an end when his father finds out and he puts a stop to it. He then returns to Paris, and he gets involved politically with one of the great problems of an absolutist form of government, which is that if you hack off a noble person, good luck finding any due process or judicial way of vindicating yourself over against those in power. Voltaire received an insult from a French noblewoman, and he replied pretty aggressively to her. He was eventually beaten for this by some of the men of her entourage. He then presses the case, at one point offering to have a duel to defend his own honor. At which point the king gets involved, because of course this is part of a noble house. And Voltaire is, without process and without a trial, imprisoned in the Bastille. And historians are not always in agreement on this, but it does seem to be the case that this is a pivot for Voltaire. He actually takes the name Voltaire at this point. And I won't go into it, but there are debates as to what the name might mean. There's no real cryptic undertone here, it's just there are differences of opinion as to what the origin is. But he takes the name Voltaire, and it becomes, you might say, a symbol of his now reaction against both political absolutism as well as the religious oppression in his own day. Eventually, Voltaire makes the case to the crown that he would not be left to languish in prison, but that he would be allowed to be exiled in England. The crown actually agrees, and so for a number of years, Voltaire moves to England and he lives in London. So here's the moment. Voltaire is quite hacked off, quite angry at the abuse of power, as well as his noticing of those who are suffering plight for their religious views. He now transfers to an entirely different country, where he experiences all kinds of things that he thinks are the medicine that France needs to take. England, of course, had a constitutional monarchy. It had a balancing of the central government of the king as well as the elected parliament. He finds this to be extraordinary. There are all types of rights and privileges within the English context that were not afforded to people in the French context. So he begins to form some of his ideas politically as to how absolutism ought to be overthrown. Voltaire also comes into contact with all number of different Protestants. In fact, one of the later works he eventually writes is called the Philosophical Letters, and it dropped like a bomb on French culture, because in it he describes not Catholic culture, and he doesn't attack it. Rather, he lays out all manner of different Protestant faiths, how they are to be commended, though at times he does speak negatively of some of these groups. Voltaire in particular points out that the Quakers are a persecuted group, a suppressed group that should be commended for their steadfastness in their views, and that they ought to not be persecuted for this. While in London, Voltaire also becomes enamored with the scientific revolution. This is, of course, the heyday when the name of Isaac Newton is at its apex. There's some accounts that say that Voltaire actually attended Newton's funeral while he was there in London. We're not quite sure about that, but it at least speaks to his fascination with the process of the scientific revolution. He sees in it, just as a lot of other Enlightenment folks did, the hope of progress and change and a rational foundation for the life of a European. So Voltaire eventually is restored to the French world. He is allowed to come back, and he comes back, you might say, as a celebrated voice. Here's a man who has been treated wrongly, and he never ceases to remind people of this fact. But he has also had his eyes opened to the problems that are before him, he believes, in European culture, as well as some of the solutions that he wants to suggest. So again, he comes back to France, and he spends a number of years really developing his vocabulary and his engagement with the Enlightenment culture, in particular with the sciences. He reads Newton almost devotionally. He just simply loves the revolution in the scientific world that Newton has given to Europe. Voltaire, of course, is more of a poet and a playwright, and at a later date, he actually travels to the city of Geneva, where he lives for a time. And Geneva in this day is still very Calvinistic. It's still very much part of the post-Reformation world. Now, what's interesting is plays, the stage, had been outlawed there in Geneva. And so some of the works and some of the plays that Voltaire had written could not be staged. Voltaire had also, around this time, come to read the philosophy of Leibniz. Now, we don't have to go into Leibniz in any detail, but the simple way to understand Leibniz is he is a determinist. He believes that the world is fixed, that it has a structure, and that all things are predetermined. It's not the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination. Rather, it's more of a philosophical or a scientific understanding of determinism. It was also highly optimistic. The idea was that the world was going to be progressing step by step through this deterministic cycle to better and better days. Well, reacting against that, Voltaire wrote one of his more famous, widely read books known as Candide. Candide, really, you might say, is a lampooning of this deterministic, rigid, optimistic understanding of the world. So in the book, he lists all types of stories, some made up, some true, of places where the world should be seen rather more as chaotic, rather than a world that is fixed and optimistically progressing to better and better days. Now, you wouldn't say so much that Voltaire is a cynic. Rather, he is the man who is poking the idols of all the philosophies around him. He opposes the dogmatism of men like Leibniz, who believe in something of a manifest destiny of the European world. Significantly later in his life, Voltaire actually becomes involved in one of the things that becomes something of the hallmark for the modern understanding, at least at the popular level, of Voltaire. And that is that Voltaire becomes the champion of those who are oppressed. Now, Voltaire himself, by the end of his life, is not a Christian. He actually refers to Christianity as vile and one of the great plagues on humanity. And I think from the context that we've just described, you might get a sense as to what has driven him to this. He sees religion, the Catholic faith in particular, as having wed itself to the French monarchy, and therefore it becomes a tool of power and oppression. Well, at the end of his life, he ends up actually championing the causes of all types of religiously persecuted groups. He does so through persuasion. He doesn't get involved with politics himself. But he constantly lays out what he believes ought to be a society of tolerance and relativism when it comes to matters of the faith. He also continues to champion the idea that the political organs of the state ought to have checks and balances. They should not be absolutist. And this tone of Voltaire is epitomized in an apocryphal sort of urban legend as to one of his quotes. I see this quote all the time on social media, but unfortunately, Voltaire himself never said it. Still, though, the quote is a good one in terms of, you might say, describing the perspective that Voltaire was coming from. And the quote is, "I disapprove of what you have to say, but I defend to the death your right to say it." Now, we now know that that quote actually comes from a early 1900s account of Voltaire. It's not anything he himself said. But it does somewhat encapsulate what Voltaire stood for. Voltaire, in other words, was not so much trying to outlaw or suppress or get rid of religion, but rather going back to the model we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. He has moved faith of any variety, Catholic or Protestant, into the category of something that is relative. And because of that, he says, let people live how they want to live. Let them have their faith if they want to have it. He himself is not going to have it. He is not going to be very kind to Christians in terms of his understandings of their dogmas. He is still relatively anti-Protestant, for example. He actually hates the Presbyterians. He finds them to be a big bore and pretty annoying. But still, Voltaire is one of the more radicals in the 18th century in that he is calling for policies that would live in accord with the conclusions of the Enlightenment. That if religion is something that is voluntary, if it is something that is relative, then stop trying to oppose or suppress those who differ from you. So in the end, Voltaire is philosophically the heir to a lot of changes in the Enlightenment, from Descartes and others through the teachings of Locke down until his days in the 18th century. He has one of the clearest calls for a cessation to religious violence, and, more importantly, for the restructuring of politics that would allow for the voice of the everyday person not to have to suffer under tyranny.